Breaking news has shaken the fight world. Nate Diaz, the Stockton street soldier turned UFC icon, has reportedly been rushed to the hospital and is now in critical condition. Details are scarce, his team has remained silent, and fans are left grasping for answers. For years, Diaz embodied rebellion, flipping the bird inside the octagon, choking out Conor McGregor, and carrying himself as the raw voice of authenticity in a polished sport. But behind the defiance were scars, lawsuits, silence, and whispers of decline. Now, the question is haunting. Has Nate Diaz's toughest fight finally caught up with him? Nate Diaz's story doesn't start in bright arenas or under championship belts. It begins in Stockton, California, a city that has always been as hard as the people who live there. Born on April 16, 1985, into a working-class Mexican-American family, Nate grew up in a world where survival wasn't optional. It was demanded. His father worked construction, his mother juggled jobs, and his older brother Nick was already carving out a path of defiance through the streets and into combat sports. For Nate, fighting wasn't about glory. It was about identity. In a city where crime and poverty were rampant, standing your ground was the only way to be heard. At just 11 years old, Nate followed Nick into Cesar Gracie's gym, a place that would become their sanctuary. While most kids his age were playing baseball or hanging out after school, Nate was absorbing jiu-jitsu, rolling with grown men, and learning that toughness wasn't just physical, it was mental. Stockton wasn't forgiving, and neither were the mats. You had to show up, you had to push through exhaustion, and you had to be willing to bleed. Nate learned all of it early. By the time he was a teenager, Nate wasn't just training, he was living the fight life. He ran triathlons with Nick, competed in local grappling tournaments, and built his gas tank until it became his greatest weapon. At the same time, he carried himself with a chip on his shoulder that matched the city he came from. Teachers thought he was trouble. Cops kept an eye on him. But in the gym, Nate found a place where defiance turned into discipline. When he entered The Ultimate Fighter Season 5 in 2007, he was still largely unknown, just Nick Diaz's little brother. But Nate never played the background role for long. In the house, he was scrappy, relentless, and impossible to break. He outlasted Manny Gambarian in the finale, submitting him to secure a UFC contract. That night, Nate Diaz officially stepped out of Nick's shadow. He wasn't just a prospect, he was a problem. But even in those early victories, people noticed something. Nate didn't just fight, he endured. He took damage others couldn't. He kept walking forward when others broke. And as impressive as that was, it was also dangerous, because every scar, every punch absorbed, was stored away in the body. The Stockton toughness that made Nate beloved was also laying the foundation for the tragic state he may now be in, hospitalized, fragile, and fighting battles outside the cage that he may not be able to win with just willpower. Nate Diaz's career was never defined by shiny belts or dominant records. His legend was carved from moments, raw, bloody, unforgettable moments that fans replayed over and over. And none was bigger than March 5, 2016, when Nate Diaz shocked the world by choking out Conor McGregor at UFC 196. He wasn't supposed to win. He took the fight on 11 days' notice, coming in with less preparation and more questions than answers. But Nate didn't care. He walked into the cage, absorbed McGregor's best shots, and then, with blood dripping from his face, turned the tide. When McGregor tapped to a rear-naked choke, Nate grabbed the mic and delivered the line that echoed through combat sports history. "I'm not surprised, motherfuckers." That night, he became a symbol, not of championships, but of authenticity. He wasn't polished like Georges St-Pierre. He wasn't a company man like others. He was Stockton through and through. A rebel, a street fighter who could hang with the sport's biggest star and win. From that moment, Nate Diaz wasn't just a fighter, he was a movement. But movements come with consequences. Because while Nate basked in the roar of fans chanting his name, His body was taking punishment at a level that few fighters ever endure. His wars with Donald Cerrone, Gray Maynard, Jim Miller, and Jorge Masvidal weren't just entertaining, they were brutal. Each fight added new scars, new injuries, new trauma. His cardio was legendary, his chin granite, but behind those traits was a silent tax. Concussions, broken bones, scar tissue building until his face swelled from even light jabs. The UFC promoted him as a cult hero, but they never fully invested in him as a long-term star. Nate fought for scraps compared to champions. He had to fight for respect, for money, for every ounce of spotlight he earned. He went on strike, sat out for years, and became infamous for refusing to play by UFC's rules. Fans adored that about him, but it cost him consistency. It cost him opportunities, and maybe, over time, it cost him his health. The tragedy of Nate Diaz is that he never needed a belt to matter. His legacy was etched in blood and defiance. But without the structure of championship camps, the support networks that often surround long-term champions, Nate was left largely on his own. He fought hard, lived harder, and in doing so, he may have pushed his body past the point of no return. Now, as rumors swirl of him lying in a hospital bed in critical condition, fans are left asking, was this the price of being Stockton's soldier? September 10, 2022 was supposed to be Nate Diaz's perfect send-off. At UFC 279, he submitted Tony Ferguson in the 4th round with a guillotine choke and walked out of the octagon with his head held high. For once, the story ended on his terms. No embarrassing knockout, no humiliating loss. Just Nate doing what he did best, bleeding, enduring, and finding a way to win. The crowd roared, and many believed this was the right goodbye. Nate, the outlaw of MMA, had left the UFC cage in victory. But walking away from fighting is never as clean as it looks. The octagon was his identity. The chaos was his oxygen. And without it, the silence began to consume him. He moved into boxing, taking a fight with Jake Paul in 2023. It was a spectacle, but it wasn't Nate at his best. He looked slower, less sharp, unable to cut off the ring. He lasted all 10 rounds, but the decision loss highlighted what fans feared. Nate wasn't the same anymore. Then came 2024, a rematch with Jorge Masvidal. The fight was hyped as a grudge match, two warriors settling unfinished business. Nate won by majority decision, throwing over 700 punches in a display of volume and grit. But even in victory, it was clear something was wrong. He was slower, hittable, and afterwards, there was no glow of triumph, just exhaustion. Worse still was what happened after. A lawsuit against the boxing promotion Fanmio revealed that Nate claimed he was owed $10 million, but had only received a fraction. For a man who left the UFC demanding respect and independence, this was a betrayal of the worst kind. Behind the scenes, whispers grew louder. Nate was stressed, isolated, and increasingly distrustful of everyone around him. This is where the cracks widened. Without the UFC structure, without loyal teammates keeping him grounded, Nate disappeared into a life of luxury and lawsuits. His once vibrant connection to fans grew quiet. His training seemed sporadic. His public appearances showed a heavier, slower version of the man who once ran triathlons and sparred for hours. And now, as the news breaks that Nate Diaz has been hospitalized in critical condition, fans can't help but wonder, did the exit from the UFC, the lawsuits, and the silence all pile up into this moment? Did walking away from the sport that gave him purpose leave him defenseless against the chaos outside the cage? For a man who always thrived in battle, maybe the quiet was the deadliest fight of all. When Nate Diaz walked away from the UFC after UFC 279, it was supposed to be a victory lap. He had beaten Tony Ferguson, closed his contract on a high note, and announced that he was going to explore opportunities outside of the organization that he had fought with for over a decade. Fans expected him to take control, to finally cash in on his name in a way the UFC never allowed. And in some ways, he did. But the harsh truth was that freedom also meant exposure. Without the UFC's structure, Nate Diaz was on his own, and the weight of that independence began to crush him. The Jake Paul fight in 2023 was the first example. The spectacle was huge, sold-out arena, millions watching on pay-per-view. Diaz fought with heart, but the result fight wasn't the fairy tale he had hoped for. Paul's youth and size advantage made Nate look slow, labored, and one-dimensional. He made it to the final bell, but it wasn't a triumph. It was a reminder that time waits for no one, not even Stockton soldiers. Fans online began to say things like he should have retired after Ferguson, and this is painful to watch. Those whispers, though harsh, began shaping his image. The Masvidal fight in 2024 was supposed to redeem him, and in many ways, it did. Diaz threw over 700 punches, survived the storm, and walked away with a majority decision win. But again, victory felt hollow. He looked older, heavier, and the magic wasn't quite the same. What should have been a redemption arc became a shadow of his prime. But the true tragedy wasn't the performance. It was what came after. Diaz filed a lawsuit against Fan Mio, the promotion behind the Masvidal fight, claiming he was owed $10 million, but had only received a fraction of that. Court filings and rumors painted a disturbing picture. Broken promises, delayed payments, and a fighter who felt betrayed at the highest level. For Nate, this wasn't just about money, this was about respect. After years of feeling underpaid in the UFC, he had finally gone out on his own. And it ended with him being shortchanged and humiliated. That lawsuit didn't just drain him financially, it drained him emotionally. Friends close to him hinted that he was more reclusive than ever, less willing to show up at public events, and increasingly distrustful of those around him. The Stockton warrior who once seemed invincible, flipping off crowds and daring the world to doubt him, was now barricading himself from that same world. Loneliness, lawsuits, and the slow realization that his independent empire wasn't as secure as he hoped. All of it began eroding the foundation. And then came the rumors. Nate drinking more heavily than usual, nights out that ended in confrontations, long stretches of silence where even old teammates said, "I haven't heard from him in a while." The fighter who once lived off the love of fans was now hiding from them. Stockton pride turned into Stockton exile. And it was here, in this fragile state, that the cracks widened into a collapse. For years, Nate Diaz's greatest strength was his durability. He was the man who could absorb punishment, bleed buckets of blood, and keep walking forward as if nothing could stop him. His cardio was legendary, his chin unbreakable, but that very durability became the trap. Because every punch, every war, every 5-round bloodbath left marks that didn't fade. And by 2025, those marks weren't just visible, they were devastating. Fans started noticing it in public appearances. Nate walked with a limp. His knees looked stiff. He carried extra weight around his midsection. At autograph signings, people whispered about how much older he looked, how worn his face seemed. Online forums speculated openly. Does Nate have CTE? He looks like he's aged 20 years in 5. These weren't just cheap shots. They were observations from fans who had followed his entire career. The human body can only take so much. Diaz's face was already riddled with scar tissue. His speech patterns, always slurred by Stockton drawl, seemed to be slowing further. Some said his memory was slipping, that he repeated himself more than before. Others pointed to his erratic behavior on social media, bizarre posts, sudden disappearances, cryptic captions. To some, it looked like a man trolling. To others, it looked like the early stages of neurological decline. And beyond speculation, there was the obvious. Diaz's fighting style had always been reckless. He wasn't elusive like Mayweather. He wasn't tactical like Georges St-Pierre. He was a grinder, a brawler, a man who wore his opponents down by taking as much damage as he gave. That kind of career doesn't age gracefully. Every strike absorbed in the cage was a debt coming due, and in 2025, it seemed the bill had arrived. Rumors grew louder about health issues, arthritis in his knees, chronic fatigue, insomnia. A few insiders whispered that Nate had been advised by doctors to stop training altogether, that his joints were deteriorating faster than expected for someone his age. Some even speculated about autoimmune conditions triggered by years of extreme physical stress. None of it confirmed, but all of it plausible for a man who lived in a cycle of punishment for decades. And now, with news of him being rushed to the hospital in critical condition, the speculation has become terrifyingly real. Was it a heart issue? Was it neurological? Was it the long, unseen damage finally boiling over? No one knows. But one thing is certain. Nate Diaz's body, which had carried him through unimaginable wars, was now a prison, and that prison was collapsing from the inside. Perhaps the most haunting part of Nate Diaz's decline wasn't the lawsuits or the physical toll. It was the silence. For a man who built his career on defiance, on speaking loudly when no one wanted to hear him, his sudden quietness was jarring. Fans who once saw him flipping off Dana White at press conferences now barely heard from him at all. Interviews became rare. Social media posts turned sporadic, often cryptic. Long stretches went by where Nate vanished completely. Silence is dangerous. For some fighters, it signals focus, preparation, plotting a comeback. But for Nate, it felt different. It felt like retreat. Insiders claimed he wasn't training consistently, that he no longer trusted gyms or sparring partners the way he used to. He keeps to himself now, one source allegedly said. He doesn't want people around him. That isolation became fertile ground for rumors. Some said Nate was drinking heavily. Others whispered about substance abuse, fueled by late-night videos where he looked glassy-eyed and incoherent. A few suggested he was battling depression, struggling with the loss of identity that comes when the lights go out and the cage is no longer there to define you. Stockton's soldier, who once thrived in chaos, now seemed defeated by the silence of his own thoughts. And then came the moment that shattered everything. The reports that Nate Diaz had been rushed to the hospital, his condition listed as critical. No confirmation, no statements from his team. Just whispers, leaked screenshots, and journalists reporting what little they knew. Immediately, speculation ignited. Was it substance-related? Was it a seizure triggered by years of damage? Was it a complete mental breakdown that spiraled into a medical emergency? The truth wasn't clear, but the reality was unavoidable. Nate Diaz was no longer untouchable. The man who once stood bleeding and smiling under the brightest lights was now, according to reports, lying in a hospital bed with his life in question. And maybe, in hindsight, the signs were there all along. The silence, the isolation, the lawsuits, the broken body, the lost fire, all pointing to a man unraveling quietly, tragically, before the world ever realized. When news broke that Nate Diaz had been rushed to the hospital in critical condition, the MMA world froze. For a fighter who had always seemed indestructible, bleeding, battered, yet always walking forward, the idea of him lying unconscious, hooked up to machines, felt almost unreal. The headlines didn't give details. The reports were vague, citing only medical emergency. But the whispers spread faster than the facts, and fans were left piecing together what might have happened. Speculation spiraled immediately. And with Nate's history, there were multiple theories, none comforting. The first was substance-related. Over the years, countless late-night videos had surfaced of Nate at clubs, surrounded by drinks, appearing out of it. Some fans dismissed it as the Diaz lifestyle. Others saw warning signs, the slurred words, the glassy eyes, the unpredictable mood swings. Rumors suggested that years of mixing alcohol with prescription painkillers had caught up, that his body had finally collapsed under the strain. Nothing was confirmed, but the possibility lingered. The second theory was neurological. For years, fighters, coaches, and doctors had warned about the dangers of repeated head trauma, and Nate Diaz had taken more punishment than most. His granite chin, the trait fans celebrated, might have been his undoing. Some suggested he suffered a seizure brought on by cumulative brain trauma. Others speculated about undiagnosed CTE, the silent killer that has haunted athletes across all contact sports. If this were true, Nate's condition might not be temporary. It could be the beginning of a permanent decline. A third, darker possibility was raised by those close to him: mental health collapse. Nate had always been defiant, stubborn, resistant to showing weakness. But those same qualities can turn inward. The silence, the isolation, the cryptic social media posts. Some believed they weren't signs of preparation for a comeback, but warning signals of a man struggling with depression. Was this hospitalization a result of self-destruction, a desperate spiral that finally broke through the walls he had built around himself? And then, in a whisper few wanted to believe, came the idea of betrayal, that maybe Nate's downfall wasn't just self-inflicted, that the people around him, the so-called friends and business partners, had exploited him until there was nothing left. The lawsuit against Fanmio showed how easily he could be cheated. If money and trust had disappeared, maybe Nate was left not just broken physically, but financially and emotionally. A collapse not just of body, but of empire. The truth remained unknown. But as speculation grew, the tragedy of Nate Diaz's collapse wasn't just in the mystery of what happened. It was in how inevitable it all seemed. Fans began asking not, "How did this happen?" but "How did we not see this coming?" The MMA community has always had a complicated relationship with Nate Diaz. He was never the champion who fit neatly into promotional packages. He was raw, unpolished, a rebel who cursed at pressers and slapped opponents mid-fight. But that authenticity made him beloved, not just by fans, but by fighters who admired his unwillingness to bend. And now, with the news of him in critical condition, the entire fight world seemed to pause in stunned silence. Dana White, the UFC president, who had clashed with Nate for years over money and respect, issued only a brief no comment. It wasn't silence out of indifference. It was silence that hinted at something deeper, something serious. Other fighters began posting cryptic messages. Conor McGregor, Nate's greatest rival, dropped a prayer emoji without words. Jorge Masvidal, who had shared wars with him, posted a broken heart symbol. Dustin Poirier simply wrote, "Respect always, Stockton soldier." Even Nate Diaz, his brother, the man who had fought beside him his entire career, went silent on social media, something that spoke louder than any words could. For fans, the shock turned quickly into mourning, even before anything was confirmed. Online forums filled with tributes, highlight reels, and messages begging for Nate to pull through. "Don't let this be the end," one fan wrote. Another posted, "We grew up watching him fight. We can't lose him like this." The sense of helplessness was palpable. This wasn't just a fighter in trouble. This was a man who had represented a culture, a city, a generation of fans who saw themselves in his defiance. But not all the reactions were sympathetic. Critics pointed out that Nate's lifestyle had always been reckless, that he had courted destruction by refusing to evolve, refusing to walk away. He chose this path, some wrote. He always wanted to live on his own terms. Others argued that the UFC and fight industry had failed him, that they had used his blood, his name, his defiance to sell fights, and then abandoned him when his body broke. "This isn't just Nate's tragedy," one columnist wrote. "It's MMA's tragedy. It's what happens when fighters are treated like disposable gladiators." The shockwaves spread beyond MMA. Sports channels across the globe ran segments reminding viewers of Nate's iconic fights, his rivalry with McGregor, his Stockton slap. News outlets like BBC and CNN picked up the story, treating it as not just sports news, but a human story of a man whose body and life had finally buckled under the weight of his legend. Even non-MMA fans began talking about him, remembering that one viral night in 2016 when he made the biggest star in the sport tap out.